Coming up.
We've spent a lot of time on ArriveCan. I thought just when you can't get a worse report than ArriveCan, along comes EDC saying, hold my beer. On page 18, you take the bold step of stating that a Crown corporation was in conflict of interest over a program it administered on behalf of the Government of Canada. That's not stated every day by the Auditor General.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
From the Office of the Auditor General, with Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada. Thank you for coming in today and bringing your entire team, who I'll just run through here, along with Mr. Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General, Mélanie Cabana, Principal, Jean Goulet, Principal, Sami Hanouch, Principal, Gabrielle Lombardi, Principal, Nicholas Swale, Principal. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you very much, Auditor General. It's my intention to get through 2 full rounds, which will take us to about 12:20, I expect. The first round will consist of 4 members, 6 minutes each, although members can split their time. I understand Mr. Halan, you'll be opening up for us today. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Ms. Hogan, thank you to you and your team for putting this report together. Once again, we're here. We're here talking about another sad example of Liberal waste and abuse of taxpayer money and pure government incompetence, just like what we saw with CERB and again with Arrive Scam. This time it's $3.5 billion of CEBA loans that went to ineligible recipients. Ms. Hogan, is this incompetence not due to lack of proper oversight and of a lack of safeguards with taxpayers' money?
I think the first thing I would want to point out about the Canada Emergency Business Account was the speed at which $49 billion of loans went out to businesses. Waiting less than a month is very quick. But the rollout of this program did have some questionable elements when it came to contract management by Export Development Canada. So while 91% of loans went to eligible businesses, we did identify that $3.5 billion went to ineligible businesses. Export Development Canada has already started to recover some of those, but I am concerned that they have partially disagreed or partially accepted our recommendation about following up, and this concern, this lack of following up concerns me.
Was this not because of a lack of safeguards?
Well, issuing loans to ineligible recipients is about having payment controls. So with most COVID programs, this one too had limited prepayment controls.
Right.
While there were some validation checks, loans did go out to ineligible businesses. What we did see EDC do, however, was adjust at the beginning and start doing post-payment work, which was different compared to other COVID programs.
Sorry, I just have a limited amount of time, so I have to move on. So we know that Accenture was given, once again, by the Liberals, a sole source contract. This is a multinational corporation that was awarded a sole source contract. Almost 92% of contracts went to them to once again cover up the incompetence of the ministers on the Liberal side. This company took Canadians to the cleaners, and that almost $300 million plus went to Accenture, but what did Canadians get for that? Does it not say that giving this sole source contract to Accenture means that this government had bungled the program?
So this is a different program than other COVID programs. We actually here saw a Crown Corporation delivering a program that normally we would have expected to see delivered from the public service. Because of that, I would have expected better oversight by the Department of Finance and Global Affairs, and they really did fail in their responsibilities to exercise oversight over that Crown. What the EDC decided to issue non-competitive contracts to Accenture. I'm concerned about the over-reliance that they have put on this one single vendor.
Right.
And the lack of oversight by departments is such that bad decisions are not being questioned, and I would have expected better from the use of public funds.
You said in previous reports that the government can't use COVID as an excuse for this kind of incompetence. Is this not another example of that happening again?
I would expect a basic level of due diligence and monitoring regardless of the situation. And here what we saw was a poor contract management from Export Development Canada and lack of oversight by federal departments of a Crown corporation administering a significant COVID support program.
Thank you. Mr. McCauley, I understand you're going to pick it up from here. You've got
Thanks.
2 minutes and 15 seconds. The floor is yours.
AG Hogan, thanks very much. Just quickly on the public accounts, last Wednesday in Senate Finance, a senior TBS official said, and I quote, "The public accounts have been transmitted to the AG." Do you have the final version of the public accounts yet?
I expect to receive the final version of the financial statements today. That was what I was informed of at the end of last week.
So they did not, as TBS said, send you the public accounts for final sign-off?
We don't have the final statements. Our audit is ongoing, and obviously we
Thanks.
work with different versions,
I
but
question
we
why
don't have the
Treasury
final.
Board would actually state that publicly, but thanks for your work on the CEBA. You know, we've spent a lot of time on ArriveCan. I thought just when you can't get a worse report than ArriveCan, along comes EDC saying, "Hold my beer." There's a line from your report that says Accenture was involved in proposing solutions to implementing program changes, determining contract scope and prices with little challenge from EDC. Can you expand on that? Like, this seems very much like GC Strategies being involved in setting up RFPs that only they could win.
So these contracts were all issued in a non-competitive fashion to Accenture. We did conclude that EDC handed over too much control to this vendor.
Did they violate procurement rules by allowing Accenture to basically choose themselves for subcontracting?
So the Crown Corporation isn't subject to the government's procurement rules. They have their own set of rules.
But that doesn't allow them to throw away taxpayers' money by giving business to themselves, setting their own prices.
I agree. There was an over-reliance here on hourly-based contracts, which is not what you would typically see in the public service. Having fixed price is the better approach to ensure better value for money. EDC here handed over too much control in those hourly contracts, saying, help us with the scope and how much will this cost, when I would have expected much better from the public service when it comes to managing a contract.
I would have expected the public service not to give a contract to Accenture and tell them you can take taxpayers' money and hire your own self and set your own prices and decide how much taxpayers would pay for those services. Would you not?
You're highlighting a process where Accenture, or where EDC and Finance and Global Affairs had identified the need to move to a competitive process because they were concerned about the over-reliance on Accenture. EDC, however, turned to Accenture and asked them to run a mini competitive process to find a vendor to develop a loan accounting software. In the end, what happened is that a recommendation was made to provide the work to a wholly owned subsidiary of Accenture. So in effect, they ran a competition and then received the contract, and that is unacceptable.
It sounds like
in the
fraud.
public
Mr. McCauley,
service.
Mr. McCauley, we are well over our time. I'm moving on to Mr. Erskine-Smith. Please, you have the floor.
You rightly made note that there was too much control given up. At the same time, when you're reflecting on the rollout and the fast rollout, and speed was the necessity in a crisis as we faced, did you expect perfection?
So I think, as I've mentioned in all my other reports on COVID relief programs, what the government did to quickly roll out funding to support businesses and individuals followed international best practices. You would expect limited prepayment controls with then the expectation that more significant work is done after the funds have been dispersed. And you rightly identify that $49.1 billion in loans was quickly dispersed to almost 900,000 businesses across the country. Most waited less than a month to receive that funding. And when you recognize that the objective that in early 2020 was to help support these businesses cover expenses they just couldn't defer. That was a success. What wasn't a success?
I want to get to the especially in relation to partial disagreement, because I note from your opening remarks that is a source of frustration. I do want to say, though, that, the $49.1 billion that is rolled out and the $45.6 billion that went to recipients that were deemed eligible on your assessment, I mean, this was, in the words of the opposition leader, these were big fat government programs, and we should have just been cutting red tape and cutting taxes for small business that had no customers. And I can think of many small businesses in my riding that would not exist today were it not for a program like this. And so, I do worry that a program like this gets politicized such that people go, well, this shouldn't have happened. This should never have existed. It's all. I just heard allegations of corruption before we even got into it, as if this was worse than a Arrive can. Okay, so anyway, I want to get to your frustration, because on my reading of it, I was a bit confused. EDC says they've partially agreed, and then Finance agreed with your assessment. What do you make of that?
So the recommendation you're talking to is the one that we provided to Export Development Canada in order to follow up and confirm whether or not the $1.5 billion that we identified that potentially went to ineligible recipients, to identify whether or not that's accurate. The information that we were able to look at clearly indicated that these businesses were not eligible, but an additional follow-up could happen with those businesses to confirm. EDC partially agrees because they believe that they need to do a cost-benefit analysis and follow up if there were viable recovery options, but also their view is that they don't have the mandate by the government to do that kind of work. And this is where I raised the uniqueness of this program, where a program was given to a Crown corporation that's meant to be at arm's length from the government, but is delivering something that the public service would normally deliver, which is why the accountability and oversight from Department of Finance and Global Affairs is so key. But there was so much confusion over what their roles were, and it led to what I would call an accountability void. And when that happens, no one was keeping their eye on the costs. And this program could have been delivered for less money if there was less reliance on one sole vendor through non-competitive process.
Well, let's pull those pieces apart, though, because there's the vendor issue, which let's get to that second. And first, just in relation to recouping loan forgiveness from ineligible small businesses, obviously where it makes sense to do so, where they are obviously ineligible, where they're doing their own audit, as you say. You've identified businesses. Okay, EDC, go do the work line by line to assess whether these were truly ineligible, and if they were ineligible, then what's your process for going and getting the money back? EDC has said in response to your report that they agreed to work with Finance Canada to consider appropriate post-funding actions, including examining legal implications and options to recoup loan forgiveness from ineligible recipients. Finance has said agreed. The department agrees to work with EDC to consider appropriate follow-up actions, including examining legal implications and options to recoup loan forgiveness from ineligible recipients. So what more are you looking for from EDC and from Finance in relation to recouping loans from ineligible recipients? Well, what commitment do you want to see from them? Because Finance has said they agree, and EDC has said partially agree, but on that particular piece, they say they will consider appropriate post-funding actions. So presumably, we should haul them in front of us, and we should ask them what those actions are going to be.
Yeah. So if you keep reading Export Development Canada's response, you'll see further on that they say that they'll only undertake the work if examination of post-funding actions identifies viable recovery options, and if EDC receives revised policy direction from the Government of Canada. They currently believe they do not have the direction to do this.
Very much. Mr. Vist, Mr. Vist, you have the floor for 5 minutes. I understand you might be sharing it. I'll let you determine when that is. Thank you.
Thank you. So on page 12 of the report, it outlines that there was no administrative oversight. Page 16 clearly outlines that there was sole source contracting. Throughout the report, it outlines that that was awarded to Accenture to the tune of $342 million. On page 19 of the report, you question whether there's any value for money in the way that these programs were administered. On page 20, you outline that EDC did not assess the reasonableness of contracts. It did not verify invoices. On page 24, you talk about a lack of ministerial oversight. On page 18, you take the bold step of stating that a Crown corporation was in conflict of interest over a program it administered on behalf of the Government of Canada. That's not stated every day by the Auditor General. So how did EDC get around these checks and balances? That's my first question. And my second question is relates to the response on page 45, where EDC states, in contravention of your recommendation, that EDC is responsible for providing oversight of the administrative expenses of the CEPA program. What recommendation would you give to this committee and to Parliament if EDC did not follow its own rules and guidelines in respect to the conflict of interest laws of Canada?
So there's a lot in your question. I think I would sum it up by saying what you're highlighting is what I'll call an accountability void. When a program was given to a Crown Corporation, recognizing that a Crown Corporation is supposed to remain at arm's length from the Government of Canada, it meant that the departments who were providing direction needed to exercise better oversight. And that's where Department of Finance and Global Affairs, in my mind, failed in their responsibilities. When you have this accountability void where roles and responsibilities aren't clear, what the outcome is for me is that no one was keeping an eye on the costs, that there were poor management decisions about contracts that didn't go challenged, but also no spending limits. And that's why we concluded that, that while the program met its objectives of getting funding quickly to businesses, the value for money was compromised by the extreme poor contract management by Export Development Canada, but also the lack of oversight by the two departments that should have been providing it.
It was clear in your report that the EDC and likely Finance Canada and Global Affairs Canada had a chance to make things right after the initial contracts were awarded. Yet they chose to buckle down and stick with Accenture. It almost seemed like EDC was doing everything in its power to award a multinational corporation more power and oversight to set the terms and conditions for hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. How do we stop this from happening again?
I think at the beginning of this program, Export Development Canada made the government aware that they didn't have the capacity, the expertise, or the tools to run this program. They asked for some oversight. They informed the Department of Finance and Global Affairs that they were going to be turning to a third party to rely on them to deliver this. What I would have expected would have been better monitoring once that sort of expectation was made available by Export Development Canada. Once they said we want some oversight, more should have been put in place. When it comes to the contract, all parties involved realized after a while that they should turn to competitive contracts instead of non-competitive.
The problem is that they didn't.
Not managing that conflict of interest, in my mind, was unacceptable by EDC.
We'll stop there.
It should not be how business is done in the public service.
Mr. Lauren, you have just over a minute, please.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. So just to put this in layman's terms, so if we count a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary, as being controlled by the same institution or effectively the same institution, we had Accenture contracting with Accenture for whatever they defined as the amount of money they get for whatever work they would do with taxpayers' dollars. So Accenture was effectively contracting with Accenture.
So EDC asked Accenture to run a quasi-competitive process where a few vendors were able to provide a bid to develop a loan accounting software. One of those was a wholly owned subsidiary of Accenture. In the end, the recommendation was made to Export Development Canada that wholly owned subsidiary should receive the contract. Ultimately, what happened is EDC signed a contract with Accenture in order to deliver this loan accounting software. It is that kind of lack of managing a conflict of interest that I would have expected EDC to have done better. There are clear rules and guidance in the federal public service, and they should have removed either Accenture or the wholly owned subsidiary from the process.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. And then Ms. Khalid.
During COVID, there was an urgency to ensure that small businesses, especially that were taking the CEBA loan, for example, would have delivery of funds as soon as possible so that they wouldn't renege on their cash overtures and their obligations as well. So my question to you then is, what is the public services capacity in a really dire situation that small businesses were facing during COVID-19 to be able to deliver the programs as quickly as they were able to be delivered? And in your report, you mentioned that the majority of the money has been reimbursed to the government. What is the process then? Do we need to improve the public service contracting in this point?
So both the public service and the Crown Corporation in this case have exceptions to sort of competitive process in times of emergency. And that's what was used to justify the non-competitive contracts at the beginning. We saw that in many situations, and it's a very reasonable approach in order to ensure quick service to Canadians. What I would have expected is how this program carried out, that steps would have been taken to avoid that continued reliance. And currently, with the last contract that's been issued, the government is bound to Accenture till 2028 with the loan accounting software. That lack of recognizing when it's time to bring things back into the public service, I've criticized in other reports, and it's again here. That over-reliance shouldn't happen.
With respect to the CEBA loans, there have been measures taken by EDC, by the government, to bring back the money now over these past number of years. COVID lasted for about 3 years, and the impact on small businesses, I would say, was about 5 years. So when we question, and in your report, you talk about the value for the money. Well, what about the context in that value for money? How do you judge the context in terms of the dollars spent versus the impact that it had on Canadians?
It's a question that we asked ourselves at the beginning. If you look at all the administrative fees, they're low compared to the total dollar values of loans that were dispersed. Is that good value for money? Well, I'm telling you, the mismanagement of those contracts leads me to conclude that that the government compromised that value for money. It could have been done for less in a more efficient way. You're right that 91% of businesses who received the funds were eligible, but the lack of recognition at the beginning that this was a loan program and that you would have to deal with repayments and potentially collecting on defaulted loans is resulting in more costs. And that's why many of our recommendations are about improving the contract terms and conditions with Accenture as they go forward, or any other contracts
I take
issued.
exception because 91% of the businesses were eligible for the CEBA loans, and yet this report and what the opposition parties are doing is taking the 9% and really highlighting what went wrong, when we know that 91% of it went right. 91% of businesses were able to take advantage of this program. And yet here we are sitting talking about 9% that were not eligible that took funding. When we know that the majority of funding has been returned to the government, that this program was executed in a really quick manner. We're talking about the difference between providing support, a lifeline now to small businesses without thinking about how efficient can we be. And in this instance, it's a 9% disefficiency, I would say. Would you agree?
So I'd like to highlight that I think our report is balanced and highlights the good and what needs to be improved, regardless of the conversations that happen about our report. We go to great lengths to remind Canadians of the good work that the public service does, and then we highlight where they can do better. And here, EDC did not use some basic controls around managing their contracts, and they could have reduced the administration fees that they have been paying in order to deliver this program. And because those costs are so low, I would expect that they wouldn't disagree with the recommendation to go collect or at least identify who is ineligible in the testing that we did and confirm whether or not collection is needed. It's a low cost. You can go figure that out.
Do you think that the majority of Canadians benefited
I'll allow
from
a
this
question,
program?
but just it is brief, please.
I think it's really difficult for us to separate whether the Canada Emergency Business Account was the thing that really helped small businesses versus rent relief or the wage subsidy. I think it's clear that many businesses needed this in order to cover non-deferrable expenses, but whether or not it in itself was the sole reason that businesses survived or not, we could not determine.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Before I adjourn, I just want to make a comment on public accounts. It seems the government has put you in a bit of a if not tough spot, Ms. Hogan, a speedy spot in that these reports, of course, for as long as I've chaired this committee, parliamentarians have wanted the public accounts sooner rather than later. I understand you're going to get them today. Parliament will rise 2 weeks tomorrow, and generally 2 weeks is your turnaround time. I understand you're going to be working a little faster behind the scenes, and I applaud you for that. But I'd also ask you that you not make any problems your problems, that should you see something in public accounts that concerns you, to send them back to the government. It seems I always get nervous when deadlines are upon government, that sometimes corners are cut. I'm sure that will not happen in your department, but we look forward to your review and those documents as soon as possible. On that note, I'll adjourn the meeting, and we'll see you all back here very soon. Thank you.